Kind employee gives free food to a homeless man, but when she learns who he really is, everything changes. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe as we upload at the same time every day. Lena knew she was risking everything the moment she extended her hand to that trembling, hungry man outside the restaurant's back door. She could already hear her manager's voice echoing in her mind. No freebies, no exceptions. Everyone who worked under Mr. Hastings understood the unspoken rule. His rules were the law, and breaking them could cost you your job, or at the very least, earn you a cruel reprimand in front of everyone. Lena had only been an employee at Wilton's family diner for a few months, but she had gotten a solid feel for the place. She had a routine, punching in at exactly 3 p.m. for the evening shift. The second she walked through those double doors, she'd tie on her apron, plaster a polite smile on her face, and get to work. Some days she dreaded the tension in the air. Mr. Hastings ran an impossibly tight ship, and most co-workers had learned to keep their heads down, do their jobs, and hope not to draw too much attention to themselves. And yet, earlier that day, she'd seen a figure rummaging through the trash near the parking lot. The figure had glanced up, revealing hollow cheeks and ragged clothes. Her heart panged at the sight. As the evening stretched on and the dinner rush slowed, that same figure crept back into view. Despite the neon signs and the smell of fresh food wafting from the diner, he looked as though he was preparing to settle for any discarded leftovers he could scavenge. That first red flag, the chilling certainty that Hastings would have no sympathy for this scenario, came screaming into Lena's mind. She knew it, the entire staff knew it. He would see one act of kindness as a personal affront to his authority. And yet, how could she just stand there? It felt inhumane to ignore that man's empty eyes. Summoning her courage, Lena prepared a small meal from the scraps that would have likely been thrown out anyway. A half serving of potatoes, a few pieces of still-warm chicken, and a roll. She made sure to sneak them into a takeout box, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds to ensure the coast was clear. Stepping outside, her heart pounding, she saw the man leaning against the brick wall, arms wrapped around himself. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the harsh wind only magnified his fragile state. The second she extended the box of food, he looked up, hesitating as though he couldn't believe she was actually offering him a meal. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaky. "I can't tell you how much I needed this." She offered a small smile, urging him, "Eat it quickly before someone sees." She was about to add that she'd be in trouble if her manager caught wind of what she was doing, but before she could voice her fears, she heard the rumble of Mr. Hastings's voice filtering through the partially propped open back door. She sensed, pressing her back against the cool wall, silently praying he wouldn't step outside just yet. The man seemed to sense her anxiety and nodded in understanding, quickly taking the box and stepping away into the shadows. When Lena slipped back into the kitchen, her heart still hammered in her chest. She couldn't help feeling as though she'd crossed an invisible line. Only a handful of employees were still bustling about, washing dishes, wiping counters, prepping for the late-night hours. She tried to calm herself by focusing on a stack of plates that needed drying, but her mind kept wandering. What if Hastings reviewed the security tapes? What if one of her co-workers, maybe someone who felt threatened by her conscientious nature, tipped him off? She took a deep breath, reminding herself she'd done the right thing, even if it threatened her job. It was an odd mixture of dread and moral satisfaction that raged within her. A co-worker named Marta, a silent observer of the diner's everyday drama, approached Lena. "You look tense," she remarked in a low voice. "Everything all right?" Lena considered lying or shrugging it off, but the weight of it all made her want to share at least some portion of her unease. "I just thought I saw someone rummaging through the trash," she said carefully, omitting the part about sneaking out free food. Marta's brow furrowed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Hastings is on a warpath. Something about controlling waste costs. Just be careful. He's got cameras and he's not afraid to check them." Lena forced a tight-lipped smile, feeling the gravity of her risk intensify. Normally, she would have considered this caution. Enough, but some moral line had been crossed tonight. She couldn't watch a human being starve, and the knowledge that Mr. Hastings would punish her for an act of compassion only solidified her distaste for him. It was the earliest sign, the brightest red flag, that the man she worked for was not just strict, he was downright merciless. Yet in that moment, Lena had no idea the so-called homeless man she'd fed was far from helpless. She had no inkling this was all a meticulously planned test by someone with far more power than she could ever have guessed. Someone who was seeing the restaurant's culture up close and personal. For now, she only sensed that a storm was brewing, and she tried to fortify herself mentally for the inevitable clash that was bound to come. The next morning, Lena woke up with a knot in her stomach, replaying the previous night's events. She couldn't shake the image of that man's gaunt face, nor could she ignore the dread creeping up her spine at the thought of Mr. Hastings' retaliation. Her shift started at noon that day, which left her with just enough time to overthink her decision 1,000 times. Meanwhile, the so-called homeless man, named Daniel, though Lena didn't yet know his name, sat quietly on a bench a few blocks away, sipping on a cup of cheap coffee he'd bought with the small amount of loose change he carried. Despite his disheveled appearance, his posture was surprisingly straight, and his eyes were alive with a keen intelligence. He'd spent the last couple of weeks traveling between different Wilton's family diner locations, collecting first-hand experiences. He'd witnessed cruelty, kindness, and everything in between. However, Lena's single act of empathy stood out in the chaos like a beacon of genuine human compassion. The precariousness of it, her obvious fear of being caught, spoke volumes. About the management environment she was trapped in, Daniel's heart was heavy with the moral complexities of his ruse. It might have been easier to reveal himself sooner, to walk in wearing a suit and tie, proclaiming, "I own this place and I want to see how it runs." But that never showed him how his employees behaved when they thought no one influential. There was watching. He'd learned that far too often. People put on polite faces for someone powerful, but their real natures appeared when they believed no one was looking. And so, here he was, living in tattered clothes, sleeping in cheap motels, or occasionally on the street just to keep up the illusion. He'd overheard employees at various branches complaining or praising certain policies, managers, and day-to-day practices. While some managers bent over backward to help both staff and community, others saw their position as a throne of absolute power. Hastings was precisely the type of manager Daniel intended to weed out. That day, Daniel decided to pay Wilton's family diner another visit to see if Lena would continue to defy the harsh rules. He had to be cautious. Too many repeated appearances might raise suspicion. But something told him that Hastings's reign was about to reach a tipping point. Around noon, Lena entered the diner, her nerves on high alert. She immediately noticed Hastings lurking by the register, scanning the room with a hawk's eye. "You're late," he barked, even though she was technically right on time. "Clock in faster. We've had enough slackers around here." Lena swallowed hard, biting back the urge to correct him. She quickly clocked in and made her way to the kitchen. Marta shot her a sympathetic look. Another co-worker, Joel, mouthed, "Watch out," behind the manager's back. The environment felt stifling, like everyone was just waiting for the next confrontation. About an hour into her shift, Lena was restocking napkins at a side station when she spotted Daniel slip into a booth near the window. He still wore the same shabby jacket, but there was something different in his expression, a sense of purpose maybe. She felt a pang of relief that he seemed okay, although the sight of him also triggered that gnawing worry about Mr. Hastings's reaction. Doing her best to appear casual, she approached the booth to take Daniel's order. He offered her a small smile, his eyes conveying gratitude. "Hey," she said softly, "are you all right?" He nodded, speaking just above a whisper. "I'm fine, but thank you again for what you did last night. You didn't have to." She busied herself with the menu in front of him. "I'm just glad you're okay," she said quietly, not wanting to draw too much attention. As she moved away, she felt Hastings's gaze snapping toward her like a whip. The intensity of his stare nearly made her drop the pen in her hand. In that moment, she knew he suspected something. Still, she pressed on, walking into the kitchen to place Daniel's modest order, just a coffee and a small side of fries, probably all he thought he could afford. But the real problem came when Hastings marched into the kitchen behind her, crossing his arms. "So you're quite friendly with that homeless man," he said, in a low, accusatory tone. He's not homeless, he's a customer, Lena replied, trying to keep her voice steady. It wasn't exactly a lie. He had sat down at a table and was prepared to pay for what he ordered, but Hastings's lips curled in a sneer. Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about. I watch the cameras, I see who lingers by the back door. You think I'm stupid? His aggression fueled Lena's anxiety, but she did her best to maintain composure. I'm just doing my job, taking orders. Uh-huh, he muttered skeptically, stepping closer, forcing her to back away. I'm warning you, if you're handing out any more freebies, you can kiss your paycheck goodbye. Lena was left, speechless. Part of her wanted to lash out, to call him heartless, to claim that she was only practicing basic humanity, but she knew that one wrong word could get her fired. She needed this job to pay rent, to keep her younger sister in college. The stakes were high, and Hastings knew it. Shaken, she walked back out to the dining area, casting a glance over at Daniel. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, stay strong. She couldn't pinpoint why, but that tiny gesture steadied her nerves. Maybe it was just nice to know she wasn't alone in this. Across the diner, Joel accidentally dropped a plate, causing a loud crash that pulled Hastings' attention. The manager stormed off to berate him, leaving Lena momentarily free of his scrutiny. She delivered Daniel's coffee and fries, her heart pounding. He thanked her quietly, then gave her a reassuring look. She wondered how he managed to remain so composed. But then again, she had no idea who he truly was beneath those ragged clothes. For now, all she knew was that the lines had been drawn. Hastings was on the warpath, and she was unwittingly a prime target. Yet she couldn't bring herself to regret feeding a starving man. If anything, it solidified her belief that Hastings's rule was not just strict, it was inhumane. In that tension-filled environment, Daniel had seen all he needed to see for the day. He sipped his coffee, observing how the other employees interacted, how they navigated the psychological minefield set by Hastings. Daniel decided that he would return later in the evening to test just how far Lena's kindness would go, and just how ruthless Hastings could become. As night fell and business slowed, Lena found herself tidying up the counter, double-checking that all condiments were restocked. Hastings was in his office, presumably poring over security footage and receipts. A hollow quiet settled over the diner, broken only by the occasional scraping of a chair or clinking of a dish. Around closing time, Daniel appeared once more, this time quietly slipping in through the front door. A few regulars were finishing up their meals, but the staff was mostly preparing for closing. Lena's eyes darted to the clock. They'd be shutting off the lights in about 30 minutes. Her pulse quickened with concern. Would Hastings blow a gasket if he saw Daniel again? She tried to busy herself with closing tasks, but she couldn't ignore the anxious feeling in her gut. She saw Daniel sit at a table that had just been vacated. He laid his hands flat on the surface, as if physically grounding himself. Lena brought him a glass of water. "We're about to close, but are you hungry?" she asked, voice hushed. He nodded slowly, looking vulnerable. "I didn't have much today. If it's okay." She took a moment to decide. In truth, she felt compelled to help, especially after seeing how frail he seemed. "Let me see what I can do," she said softly, stepping back toward the kitchen. Unfortunately, the kitchen had already started powering down the cooking equipment. The only things left were some prepped sides that would otherwise be tossed. It was official policy to discard unsold food at the end of the night, but Lena couldn't bring herself to throw it all away, especially when someone was right there, clearly in need. Gathering a modest plate of mashed potatoes, a few chicken strips and a roll, items that would literally be trashed in less than half an hour, she carefully placed them on a tray. Her heart pounded with every step toward Daniel's table. The diner was mostly empty now, and she prayed Hastings would stay locked in his office, dealing with spreadsheets or whatever else he did when not terrorizing his staff. For a moment, she let herself believe she might pull this off without incident, but as fate would have it, Hastings emerged from his office, eyes scanning the dining area. Lena tried to move swiftly, setting the tray in front of Daniel. He looked up at her, gratitude glimmering in his eyes, but also a tinge of fear. She forced a reassuring smile, turning quickly to head back to the kitchen. But Mr. Hastings's voice, sharp as a knife, cut across the near silence of the diner. "Hey, you!" He was addressing Daniel. "We're closing. Finish up and get out." Lena's stomach twisted, but she couldn't very well intervene without risking an outright confrontation. She pretended to be busy wiping down another table, all the while staying within earshot. "Sir, Daniel began, but Hastings cut him off. "I don't want excuses. You've been coming around here too often. We're not a shelter. Now pay your bill or get lost." Daniel pulled out a couple of crumpled dollar bills. "I'm paying for the coffee," he said calmly, "and I think the meal's just going to be tossed out otherwise, right?" Hastings's eyes narrowed. "That's not your call to make." At that moment, Lena's courage flared. She couldn't watch this scene without intervening. Adrenaline rushing, she stepped forward. "Mr. Hastings, I gave him that plate. It was leftover, food that would have been discarded anyway." Hastings whipped his head around to glare at her. "So you admit it? You gave him food again?" She felt her face flush. "It would have gone in the trash otherwise. I didn't see the harm." "The harm," Hastings hissed, stepping closer, "is that this is my diner, and I make the rules." Tension thickened the air, and for a moment the only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel watched this confrontation from his seat, silently gathering the final pieces of his elaborate puzzle. "Now," Hastings continued, voice dripping with malice, "you've ignored my explicit directions more than once, I'm sure." Lena realized this was it, the moment she'd dreaded. She braced for Hastings to scream at her, to humiliate her, possibly even to yank her apron off and tell her to leave, and that was exactly what he did. "Hand over your apron," he said, his voice curiously low and cold. "You're finished here." She froze, her eyes flicking to Daniel, who looked as though he was about to stand up. Despite her fear, she lifted her chin, refusing to let Hastings see her cry. "If that's what you want," she managed to say, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm just sorry that helping someone in need matters so little to you." Hastings' nostrils flared. "Don't you dare lecture me. This is business. We are not a charity." With trembling fingers, Lena untied her apron and handed it over. The remaining staff looked on in dismay. Marta covered her mouth in shock, and Joel stared at his shoes, visibly torn between wanting to speak up and fearing for his own livelihood. Hastings snatched the apron, turning to Daniel with a dismissive wave. "Finish your plate in the next 5 minutes or I'm calling the cops." That was the last straw. Daniel stood up slowly, letting his shoulders square. The room seemed to hold its breath. He parted his lips, and in a voice that resonated with unmistakable authority, he said, "No need for that. I'll leave on my own terms." Something in his tone made Hastings pause. Lena noticed a flicker of confusion cross the manager's face, as if a small part of him sensed that there was more to this man than appeared. Without another word, Daniel walked toward the door, leaving the untouched portion of his food on the table. Lena stood there, feeling tears threaten to spill, and yet she also felt a surge of pride for having tried to do the right thing. As Daniel passed by her, he whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "You did nothing wrong." Then he disappeared into the night, leaving the entire diner in a hush that seemed to echo with the repercussions of what had just happened. Hastings cleared his throat, glaring around at anyone who might challenge him. No one did. Instead, they continued their tasks, subdued, perhaps too scared to risk their own jobs. And just like that, Lena's shift, and possibly her time at the diner, ended with her termination. But what none of them knew was that Daniel wasn't done with this place. In fact, a far bigger confrontation loomed on the horizon. By the next morning, word had spread among the staff that Lena had been fired for giving out free food. Some employees were outraged, while others just grumbled about it being typical Hastings. Yet no one dared voice their anger publicly for fear of ending up in the same predicament. Lena spent that day at home, slumped on the couch, desperately scrolling through job listings on her laptop. She worried about how she'd pay rent. She worried about her younger sister, who relied on Lena's income to cover tuition. And in those moments, she also wrestled with a biting sense of injustice. Had it really been so wrong to feed someone who was starving? Meanwhile, Daniel had changed out of his tattered clothes and checked into a hotel under a different alias. He needed time to regroup and plan his next move. He couldn't let Hastings get away with this tyranny, not after seeing how the manager crushed kindness under the weight of company policy. But if Daniel walked in tomorrow in a business suit and said, "I'm the CEO, fix this," it wouldn't be the humiliation Hastings so richly deserved. No, Daniel wanted to reveal himself in a public, undeniable way that would shake up the entire structure of the diner. So he patiently waited, making calls to corporate contacts, ensuring that when the moment came, everything would be orchestrated just right. That evening, Lena received a mysterious phone call from someone claiming to be from the regional corporate office of Wilton's. Initially, she thought it might be a scam, but the man on the other end gently asked her to meet him at a nearby cafe, stating he wanted to hear her side of the story regarding her dismissal. Although she was hesitant, something in his tone sounded genuine, so she agreed. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe, her heart hammering in her chest. She worried it might be a trap, a chance for Hastings to further humiliate her or to gather evidence against her. Instead, she found Daniel waiting at a small table with 2 cups of coffee. For a split second, she didn't recognize him in normal clothes. He smiled when he saw her approach, and she realized with a jolt that this was the same man she'd given food to. He looked almost regal, despite the modest attire. "What is this about?" she asked, lowering herself into the chair across from him. "Who are you?" Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "My name is Daniel Carter. I'm associated with Wilton's Diner at a higher level. I wanted to talk to you about what happened with Mr. Hastings." Lena felt a surge of confusion and alarm. "Are you corporate? Am I in more trouble?" He gently shook his head. "Not in the way you think. Trust me, you're not in trouble." He took a breath, and in that moment, Lena noticed that the kindness in his eyes was matched by a certain gravity, as if he carried secrets heavier than she could imagine. "I posed as a homeless man to get a true sense of how employees are treated," he said, leaning in, keeping his voice low. "I saw what you did. I saw your compassion, and I also saw how Hastings reacted. I need you to help me fix this situation." Her mind whirled with questions. Was he some kind of investigator? An auditor? She couldn't fathom how or why someone would go to that length, but the sincerity in his voice kept her from dismissing him outright. Daniel continued, "I understand if you're confused or skeptical, but I can assure you, if we work together, Hastings won't be able to do this to anyone else ever again." Taking a sip of her coffee to steady her nerves, Lena tried to process the whirlwind of information. "So you're saying you can get my job back?" He offered a small smile. "I can do a lot more than that, but it starts with confronting Hastings publicly, where he can't back out and where others can see the truth." She blinked, the weight of what he was proposing sinking in. "That sounds risky. I mean, you've seen what he does to people who cross him." "I have," Daniel said quietly, "and that's exactly why I won't stand by. But I need you there, someone who's proven they're willing to stand up for what's right, even under threat." She hesitated, but the thought of letting Hastings continue his reign of terror and the potential to see justice done ignited something inside her. She thought about Marta, Joel, and the other employees who lived in constant fear of losing their jobs for minor infractions. "All right," she said finally, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "What do I need to do?" Daniel laid out a plan that involved returning to the diner at a peak time, ensuring a sizable customer presence. He'd reveal his identity in front of everyone, staff, patrons, and Hastings himself. However, he needed Lena to back him up with the facts of how she'd been fired for an act of charity. He wanted the emotional truth of the situation laid bare for all to see. The conversation lasted for nearly an hour, with Lena's initial shock transforming into cautious determination. By the time she walked out of that cafe, she felt a curious mix of excitement and dread. If Daniel was telling the truth, were about to stage a confrontation that would either end Hastings' career or, at the very least, expose his cruelty to an audience that mattered. Meanwhile, back at the diner, Hastings carried on as if he were untouchable. He barked orders at staff, penalized people for the smallest infractions, and plastered a new sign in the break room that read, "Any unauthorized food giveaways will result in immediate termination." He seemed almost triumphant about Lena's firing, smugly boasting to his assistant manager, "That'll show the rest of them who's boss." Little did he know, the real boss was about to step in. Later that afternoon, Daniel made a brief visit to the corporate office under his official capacity as the CEO, finalizing arrangements for an unannounced inspection. His corporate subordinates couldn't figure out why he was suddenly so interested in a relatively small branch of the diner chain, but Daniel offered no explanation, simply stating it was a top priority. By nightfall, everything was set, in motion. Lena, still nervous, called Marta, hinting that she might be showing up at the diner the next day with important news. Marta's confusion was evident, but Lena insisted she spread the word for employees to be on the lookout. She wanted them to be prepared for a spectacle. The final piece of the puzzle was ensuring that enough customers were present to witness Hastings' downfall. Daniel orchestrated a promotional announcement through corporate channels, something about a limited-time discount for the day. The staff at Wilton's had no choice but to comply as it came from corporate. They braced for a busy day, never suspecting the real reason for the sudden surge in foot traffic. As the sun set and Lena tried to catch some restless sleep, she felt a strange calm. This was bigger than just getting her job back. It was about standing against the type of cruelty that punishes people for acts of basic human kindness. She wondered how Hastings would react when faced with someone even more powerful than he was, someone who'd seen his tyranny firsthand. Tomorrow promised a collision of two worlds, Hastings' empire of fear and Daniel's quiet but absolute authority. And Lena would be right there in the middle, a linchpin in the plan to topple the manager's cruel reign. She had no illusions about how explosive this could get. Hastings was a bully, and bullies rarely back down without a fight. But for the first time since being fired, she felt something akin to hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the good guys could win in the end. The following day dawned with an odd sense of anticipation in the air at Wilton's family diner. A line of customers began to form earlier than usual, drawn by the advertised promotion. Inside, the staff hustled to keep up, but there was a palpable undercurrent of anxiety. Marta and Joel exchanged glances, wondering if Lena would indeed show up and what sort of important news she had. Hastings, for his part, seemed agitated by the sudden influx of business that he hadn't personally authorized. Why the hell did corporate schedule a promotion and not tell me until last night? He grumbled to the assistant manager. He prowled around the diner, snapping at servers to move faster and keep the line from piling up. Daniel arrived discreetly, wearing clothes that weren't quite as ragged as before but still unassuming. He took a seat in the back corner, observing the hustle with a calm air. He wanted to wait for the perfect moment to reveal himself. Lena was set to show up shortly, her role in this showdown crucial. Outside, Lena stood near the entrance, her heart pounding so loudly she could almost hear it in her ears. She took a few deep breaths, steeling herself for the confrontation. She pushed open the diner's glass door, stepping in like a returning ghost. The staff noticed her immediately. Marta's eyes widened. Joel nearly dropped a tray of drinks. Hastings, who'd been hovering near the register, felt her presence like a disruption in his carefully curated domain. His eyes went cold the moment he spotted her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through the general clamor of the busy diner. "Didn't I make it clear you're no longer employed?" Lena swallowed her fear. "I'm here to talk to you, Mr. Hastings." The hush that fell was almost tangible as a few customers and employees turned to watch. She glanced at the cluster of people, families, couples, and a few seniors enjoying their breakfast. Perfect. She wanted a crowd. Hastings planted his hands on his hips, trying to appear authoritative. "You have some nerve showing up during our busiest day. Get out." He snapped his fingers as if she were a dog to be shooed away. But Lena stood her ground, voice trembling only slightly. "You fired me for giving food to a man who was hungry," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "You treated me like I was stealing from you, even though what I gave away was about to be thrown in the trash." Hastings' face turned a shade of red fury radiating off him. "Watch your tone. I told you from day one, no freebies, no exceptions. That's policy. You violated policy. You're lucky I didn't press charges for theft." At that moment, Daniel rose from his seat in the corner, stepping forward with a quiet confidence that belied the chaos of the scene. He hadn't fully revealed himself yet, but his posture was different, more commanding. Some of the employees recognized him from the previous nights, though they couldn't quite place why he looked different today, less pitiful, more poised. Lena felt a surge of courage at the sight of him approaching. "Mr. Hastings," Daniel began, his voice carrying easily through the diner, "I'd like you to reconsider how you treat your staff." Hastings let out a derisive snort. "And who the hell are you?" A few employees glanced at each other, sensing something big was about to happen. Daniel paused, taking a slow breath. Lena watched him carefully, waiting for the moment he'd decided on. The tension built as he reached into his jacket, pulling out an ID badge. He held it up so that everyone could see, especially Hastings. "I'm Daniel Carter," he announced, his voice calm but resolute. "CEO of Wilton's Family Diner." Gasps rippled through the staff and customers. Marta's jaw dropped. Joel nearly spilled another tray. Hastings's sneer faltered, confusion and dread flickering in his eyes. The manager's brain seemed to short-circuit, wrestling with the impossibility of what he was seeing. "You're not serious," he finally sputtered, taking a step back. But the ID badge was unmistakable, bearing not only Daniel's name but the official corporate seal. The wave of shock spread through the diner like a brushfire, and people began murmuring in disbelief. One by one, heads swiveled to Hastings, eager to see how he'd respond. Daniel set the badge on a nearby table, letting it lie there as irrefutable proof. "I was undercover," he continued, "to understand how our employees behave when no one's watching. And what I've witnessed in this branch is unacceptable." Hastings's face turned from red to pale in seconds. That can't be," he stammered. "We had no notice of a corporate visit. There's procedure." Daniel cut him off. "I don't need your permission to visit my own company, Mr. Hastings, especially when I've received multiple complaints about how this location is run." He gestured around, eyes sweeping over the stunned employees. "I've seen the fear. I've seen the turnover rate, and I've seen how a good employee, someone who showed simple human kindness, was fired because she didn't want to let food go to waste when someone was starving." Lena felt a mix of triumph and relief bloom inside her chest. This was the confrontation she'd imagined, but now that it was actually happening, it felt surreal. Hastings, scrambling to regain control of the narrative, raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Carter, let's not blow this out of proportion. We have strict policies to prevent loss, to maintain profitability." He shot a venomous glare at Lena, as though it was her fault that the CEO had decided to disguise himself as a homeless man. Daniel shook his head. "Policy is one thing, abuse of power is another. You humiliated this woman and fired her for doing what any decent human being would do." He turned to address the entire diner now, his voice carrying a note of passion. "Wilton's is built on family values, on the idea that a restaurant is part of the community. If we can't uphold that, we might as well close our doors." Hastings' hands clenched at his sides. "With all due respect, sir, you don't understand the daily operations here. We can't just give away free meals all the time. It sets a precedent. People will exploit it." Daniel's eyes flashed. "Exploit kindness? If someone is truly hungry, I'd rather see them fed than see them dig through trash. And as for setting precedents, I'd prefer a precedent of compassion over fear." The diner was so quiet now that you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sizzle of a forgotten pancake on the griddle. Employees stood frozen. Customers stared wide-eyed. And Hastings appeared like a trapped animal frantically searching for an escape route in a situation that had escalated far beyond his control. Unable to contain his frustration, Hastings played his final desperate card. "Look, this is an outrage. I've served this company for years, always focusing on the bottom line. If that's a crime, then fine, I'm guilty. But this is a stunt." He pointed accusingly at Daniel. "Dressing up like a bum, deceiving me, deceiving everyone here. You should be apologizing to me." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd at the audacity of his words. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't owe an apology to anyone who uses policy as a shield to justify cruelty. The only apology owed here is to Lena, and to any other employee or customer you've mistreated." Hastings sputtered, looking around for anyone to back him up, but the staff kept their distance. No one wanted to be associated with his sinking ship. A few customers even pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation. If Hastings had been cunning, he might have tried to salvage the situation by apologizing or feigning a misunderstanding. But his arrogance had been cornered, and it reared up in a final burst of defiance. "Fine," he spat. "If you want to destroy everything I've built here, go ahead. But don't expect me to beg. I've done nothing wrong except enforce the rules." Daniel took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. "I'm terminating your position here, effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying a calm finality. "Gather your things and leave the premises. I'll have security and the legal department follow up if necessary." The color drained from Hastings's face. He stood there for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Then, with a final glare at Lena, he ripped off his name tag and threw it onto the floor. "To hell with all of you," he snarled, and stormed out the door. The hush lingered as everyone processed what had just transpired. Slowly, a wave of relief and awe swept through the diner, followed by scattered applause from both staff and customers. Marta was the first to clap, tears in her eyes. Joel pumped his fist, grinning from ear to ear. Daniel turned to Lena, who looked shell-shocked but radiant with renewed hope. He smiled softly. "You were brave to stand up for what was right. I'm sorry you had to go through that." In that moment, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of validation and gratitude. She found herself on the verge of tears, but managed to blink them back. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk later about your position here, and about ways to help the community so no one else has to suffer like that. For now, let's just breathe." Around E. Them? The diner buzzed with energy, as if everyone had just woken up from a long nightmare. It wasn't just about Hastings being gone. It was about the possibility that the workplace could be a place of respect and compassion after all. Customers watched the scene with fascination, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling at how swiftly justice had come. For a few moments, Daniel remained silent, allowing the tension to settle, giving people space to absorb that they had just witnessed a once untouchable manager toppled by the very man he treated like trash. Lena marveled at the irony. She had lost her job for feeding someone who had more power than any of them could have imagined. The entire situation felt surreal, and yet exactly right. Hastings had always wielded his authority like a weapon, and now that weapon had been turned against him in the most dramatic fashion possible. As the staff began to gather around Daniel, uncertain but hopeful, Lena realized her life had changed, in an instant. And though she didn't know what the future held, one thing was clear. Acts of kindness weren't punishable offenses. Not anymore. Even after Mr. Hastings stormed out of the diner, tension still hung in the air. It was the tension of disbelief and lingering shock, like everyone was collectively pinching themselves to confirm that what they'd witnessed was real. Daniel stood near the counter, and Lena noticed how the staff now approached him with a mix of awe and relief. Marta was the first to break the silence, stepping forward gingerly, as if she were approaching a lion who could just as easily roar as he could purr. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "we didn't know who you were. If we had, Please," Daniel interjected gently. "Call me Daniel. And you don't need to apologize. I was undercover. You were all just doing your jobs under very difficult circumstances." That subtle admission seemed to release some of the tension. The staff visibly relaxed, feeling a newfound sense of ease and curiosity. Joel walked up, nervously wiping his hands on his apron. "Sir, do we still have jobs here?" He glanced at the door through which Hastings had departed. Daniel smiled reassuringly. Yes, of course. Your jobs are secure. Hastings didn't represent our values. I apologize for the environment you've been subjected to. The employees exchanged relieved glances, and a ripple of optimism spread through the diner. Customers who had stayed to watch the drama unfold now began to comment among themselves. Some gave Lena thumbs up or smiles of encouragement, appreciating the stand she'd taken. Others snapped photos or recorded short videos, capturing the aftermath of a showdown that felt more like a cinematic climax than a routine day at a local restaurant. Daniel turned his attention to Lena, who was still processing the rapid chain of events. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, a bit overwhelmed. I never imagined something like this happening, and now Hastings is gone. You're the CEO. It's a lot." He offered a gentle laugh. "I know, but you're not in trouble, Lena. We have some things to figure out, but you're welcome here if you still want to work at Wilton's." "I do," she admitted, tears threatening to spill. "I need the income, but even if I didn't, I'd stay just to see this place become what it should be." He reached out, offering a handshake that felt more like a promise of partnership. Lena accepted, feeling a surge of gratitude and something else, hope for a future that just a day ago had seemed so bleak. Word traveled fast. Within the hour, corporate representatives began arriving at the diner, having heard that Daniel Carter was on site. They brought paperwork, a small security detail, and expressions that hovered between panic and reverence. For a moment it was pure chaos, executives scurrying to confirm details, customers leaning in to eavesdrop on updates, staff members buzzing with excitement. Meanwhile, Lena slipped away to the break room to collect the few personal items she'd left behind when she was fired. There she found Marta, who gave her a tight hug. "You did it," Marta whispered, tearful. "You stood up to him, and somehow the universe brought the CEO here in disguise." Lena laughed through her own tears. "I still can't believe that homeless man I served was actually our CEO." Marta patted her back. "I guess it shows you never know who might be watching." They rejoined the group in the dining area, just in time for Daniel to address the staff more formally. "I'd like to inform everyone," he began, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention, "that Mr. Hastings is no longer employed by this company, effective immediately. I will be appointing an interim manager, and will be re-evaluating the policies that have led to such a hostile environment. You deserve better." Applause broke out from both employees and customers alike. Daniel allowed a moment for the ovation, then continued. "In light of recent events, we'll also be implementing a new policy regarding unsold or excess food. Instead of trashing it, we're going to work with local shelters and community programs to ensure it goes to those who need it most." This time the applause was even louder, accompanied by cheers. Lena felt her heart swell at the announcement. It was exactly what she'd hoped for, a policy that combined common sense with compassion. And hearing it delivered by the CEO in person, in front of the entire diner, felt almost like a fairy tale ending to her nightmare. Almost. While the public confrontation had been dramatic and swift, the emotional toll lingered. Lena still felt jittery, her nerves frazzled by the sudden turn of events. But each passing minute brought more reassurance that she was on the right side of history this time. After the clapping subsided, Daniel motioned for Lena to step forward. She did so hesitantly, uncertain if he planned to address her directly in front of everyone. But as soon as she was by his side, he turned to the staff. "This is Lena," he said, letting his voice carry. "Many of you know her as a co-worker. Some of you might have wondered why she risked her job to feed a hungry man. Well, I'm here to tell you that risk shouldn't exist. Kindness shouldn't be a liability in our business or in life." Lena showed the values that truly define Wilton's. He paused, letting the significance of his words sink in. "I want to officially offer her job back, with an immediate raise to reflect her commitment to the ideals we stand for. And if she's willing, I'd also like her to help us design a training program focused on compassion and community engagement." Lena's eyes went wide, and she felt tears threatening again. The staff applauded, cheering her on. She could barely hear her own voice over the thunderous sound when she replied, "Yes, yes, I'd be honored." The moment felt almost surreal, as though she was starring in a cinematic finale. It was everything she dared to hope for and more. But before she could revel in the applause, one of the corporate reps approached Daniel, whispering in his ear. He nodded, then addressed the room once more. "We'll need to close the diner for a few hours to finish paperwork, ensure proper staffing, and reset a few things operationally. Everyone who's in the middle of a shift will of course be compensated, and we'll reopen as soon as possible to continue serving customers with the right values in place." A wave of relief washed over the staff, especially the ones who were exhausted from the morning rush. Slowly, people began to disperse, customers leaving in small groups, discussing the astonishing events they'd just witnessed, and employees moving about to tidy up while they waited for further instructions. Lena found a quiet moment to pull Daniel aside. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for giving me my job back, but for standing up for what's right." He looked genuinely moved. "The thanks goes both ways. If you hadn't shown kindness, I might not have seen the real problem at this location. You stood your ground under terrible pressure, and that's what leadership looks like. I've been wearing the CEO title, but today you showed me what true leadership is." His words lit a glow of pride within her that she'd rarely felt before. She realized that this entire ordeal, terrifying as it was, had also unearthed qualities in her that she didn't fully know she possessed. She wasn't just an employee trying to make ends meet. She was someone capable of influencing real change. As the staff busied themselves with final tasks before the temporary shutdown, Marta and Joel approached Lena to hug her, showering her with congratulations and tearful gratitude. Their eyes sparkled with relief, no longer overshadowed by the constant anxiety that Mr. Hastings had instilled in them for so long. A few other employees, ones Lena didn't know too well, also came to shake her hand or pat her on the back, wanting to align themselves with the new wave of positivity flooding the diner. In those moments of camaraderie, she felt a warmth that had been absent before, as if the entire establishment was collectively exhaling a breath they'd been holding for months, maybe even years. And at the center of it all was Daniel, the man who had disguised himself as a homeless person to see the truth of his own company. Lena found the entire idea both audacious and deeply inspiring. It was a testament that sometimes the only way to bring about genuine improvement was to step away from the comfort of power and see the world from the vantage point of those without it. The hush that fell upon the diner as it finally closed its doors for that interim period felt markedly different from the hush after Hastings had fired her. This was a peaceful calm, a collective sigh of relief, not the fearful silence of people walking on eggshells. And though the final chapter of Hastings' role at Wilton's had been written, the next chapter for the diner and its staff was just beginning. Lena felt a surge of optimism for what lay ahead. She was no longer an outcast or a victim. She was a recognized contributor, someone whose empathy had become a catalyst for transforming not just one diner's environment, but perhaps the entire chain's policies going forward. And all it took was one act of kindness, a single meal, offered to a man who turned out to be so much more than he appeared. With the diner temporarily closed for the day's restructuring, Lena found herself in a whirlwind of administrative tasks. Corporate reps wanted her statement, detailing how and why she'd been fired. She found herself reliving the fear and frustration she'd felt that night, but this time her story was met with understanding and validation, not scorn. The corporate legal team took copious notes, promising swift action to rectify any official records that might hinder her employment or tarnish her reputation. Meanwhile, in a corner booth, Daniel sat with a regional manager, discussing broader policy changes that would expand beyond a single branch. Lena caught snippets of their conversation as she walked by, phrases like food donation partnerships, employee-led community programs, and revised disciplinary guidelines. Each snippet made her more hopeful. It was as though a door to a better world had swung open, and all because one manager's cruelty had collided with an employee's compassion. During a short break, Lena stepped outside for some fresh air. She leaned against the exterior wall of the diner, recalling the moment she'd first handed that takeout box to Daniel. How terrified she had been. And now, here she was, still the same person, yet forever changed by the dramatic events that had followed. The man who'd seemed so utterly vulnerable had revealed himself to be the most powerful figure in the company. She smiled at the irony. Moments later, Daniel joined her outside. He offered a small grin, hands in his pockets. "Mind if I stand?" "Here with you." She shook her head. "Not at all, it's still sinking in," she admitted, gazing at the bright midday sky. "I never expected any of this." He nodded. "Neither did I, honestly. You know, sometimes I wonder if I went too far, deceiving everyone by pretending to be homeless. But then I see how Hastings acted when he thought no one was watching, and I realize it was the only way to see the unfiltered truth." Lena contemplated that for a moment. "I think there's value in it. Yes. You got to see what really goes on." A pause lingered before she added, "If you hadn't shown up, I'd be out of a job right now just for feeding someone who was hungry." He looked at her with genuine empathy. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. And I'm sorry for anyone else who's dealt with similar situations in our company. That's not what Wilton's should be about." She glanced at him, curiosity burning. "Why do you care so much? Most CEOs I've heard about are more worried about profits and shareholders." Daniel exhaled a soft laugh. "I inherited this company from my father. He started as a short-order cook in a rundown diner before building Wilton's into a chain. He always told me that serving food is about more than profit. It's a way to build community. I lost sight of that for a while, sitting in boardrooms reading profit and loss statements. Then the complaints started rolling in about certain managers, and I realized maybe we were drifting from the core values that started all of this. I had to know the truth." Lena felt a swell of admiration. "Well, you certainly found it," she said, turning her gaze to the passing traffic. "And you did something about it." Daniel gave a half shrug. "With your help. Don't underestimate the role you played. Hastings might still be in charge if you hadn't risked everything to feed me that night." She felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of humility and pride. "I guess so." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Daniel straightened, nodding toward the door. "We should probably get back inside. There's a lot to do, and I believe I owe you an official reinstatement letter, among other things." Lena smiled. "Right. Let's do it." They returned to find a more organized scene than the one they'd left. The regional manager was now addressing the employees, reassuring them that changes were in motion. An HR representative was distributing updated policy documents that emphasized ethics, compassion, and a zero-tolerance stance on abusive management practices. Some employees looked skeptical. After all, words on paper don't always translate to real change, but there was a cautious optimism in the air. When Daniel introduced Lena as a key advisor on employee experience, a smattering of applause spread through the staff. She tried not to let it go to her head, but the affirmation felt good, especially after how thoroughly Hastings had tried to crush her spirit. Marta elbowed her gently. "Look at you, big shot," she teased with a grin. Lena laughed, rolling her eyes. "I'm just happy to have a job again, trust me." Joel, wiping a table nearby, chimed in. "Hey, don't downplay it. This place is going to be better because of you." That sense of belonging and validation was all new territory for Lena. Just a day earlier, she was a pariah for standing up to Hastings. Now she stood at the forefront of a major shift in the company's culture. Corporate calls were made, signboards were placed, and by late afternoon the diner reopened under the watchful eye of Daniel and his team. While not every customer knew the full story, rumors had spread like wildfire. Some people even came by, specifically to see the place where the CEO, disguised as a homeless man, had staged a dramatic reveal. Despite the newfound buzz, the atmosphere remained humble, grounded in the knowledge that real improvement had to be proven over time, not just promised in a single day. Lena floated from table to table, guiding staff on the new approach to leftover food. Instead of piling it into trash bags, they prepared it in sealed containers that would be picked up by a local food pantry. One volunteer from the pantry even stopped by, excitedly snapping photos to share with their community outreach. Seeing the tangible difference it made was a balm for Lena's soul. Meanwhile, Daniel sat down with various employees in one-on-one chats to hear their stories, concerns, and ideas. He took notes offering gratitude for their honesty. He was drafting changes to the employee manual that would emphasize the kind of behavior Lena had shown, not punish it. Compassion is free, he said at one point to a small circle of employees, but it's priceless in terms of building loyalty and community goodwill. Among the staff was a wide-eyed teenage busboy who confided that he'd almost quit a week ago due to Hastings's verbal abuse. Now he felt encouraged to stay. An older server, close to retirement, admitted she'd never spoken to the big bosses before. Daniel listened intently, ensuring she felt heard. In every corner of the diner, pockets of conversation signaled a new beginning. The day ended without the usual sense of dread or exhaustion that came with Hastings' oppressive oversight. Instead, there was a cautious sense of victory, a belief that maybe, just maybe, Wilton's family diner could be a place where employees were respected and customers were treated like neighbors. As the last customer left and the staff began to clean up, Lena lingered by the same back door where she'd first offered Daniel a meal. The memory felt distant yet vivid, a surreal prologue to the events that had transformed her life and the diner. She jumped slightly when Daniel appeared, at her side, looking around as though he too was feeling the weight of memory. "It all started here, huh?" he said quietly. Lena nodded. "Yeah, me handing you that box of leftovers I thought was about to be thrown away." "I'd say it was more than just food you handed me," he replied thoughtfully. "You gave me a wake-up call, showed me that if our company punishes people for being human, then we've lost our way." A soft night breeze blew across the parking lot, carrying the distant hum of cars. In that moment, Lena realized that while she was grateful to Daniel for stepping in, the real power had come from her own willingness to act when it mattered. "I'm glad you were the one to see it," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "Otherwise, things might have turned out very differently." Daniel looked at her with a certain respect that felt more valuable than any corporate title. "So am I." They shared a moment of reflective silence, standing in the place where their worlds had collided. Each carried a piece of the other's experience now. A strange, unspoken bond formed by an act of compassion meeting an unexpected test. Finally, Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. He handed it to her, a wry grin on his face. "My real contact information. If you ever need anything, or if you have more ideas about how to make this place better, call me." Lena took the card, reading the embossed letters. Daniel Carter, CEO. It was more than just a title or a piece of paper. It was a tangible reminder that sometimes the most powerful people are those who remember what it's like to be powerless. She carefully slipped it into her apron pocket, turning her face to the gentle glow of the diner's lights. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it for so many reasons, for stepping in, for believing in her, for proving that decency could triumph in the face of meanness. As they parted ways, Lena realized she had come full circle, from a fearful employee risking her job, for a hungry stranger, to a respected voice in a company now striving to do better. She felt something in her chest relax, like a knot that had been there for a long time finally dissolving. Tomorrow, she would arrive at the diner, not as a faceless worker under a tyrant's rule, but as someone whose compassion had sparked a revolution. And that, she thought, was a beginning worth celebrating. As the weeks passed, news of the Undercover CEO and the fired manager spread across social media and local news outlets. Headlines told the story of how a diligent employee's single act of kindness had not only saved her job but toppled a tyrant. Memes popped up comparing Daniel's homeless disguise to elaborate stunts on reality TV. But this wasn't reality TV. It was real life, and the positive changes taking place at Wilton's were tangible. Headquarters rolled out new training, modules emphasizing employee well-being and community outreach. They set up partnerships with local shelters, battered women's homes, and youth centers, ensuring that extra food found its way to empty stomachs instead of dumpsters. Lena found herself busier than ever, but it was the kind of busy that felt meaningful. She regularly met with Daniel, whether in person or via video conferences, to discuss how these new initiatives were affecting day-to-day operations. He valued her input, repeatedly reminding corporate higher-ups, "Listen to the frontline employees, they know what's happening on the ground." The transformation was not without its critics. A handful of long-time managers grumbled about how giving away food could lead to profit losses, or how employees might start slacking off if they were granted more leniency. But as the weeks turned into a month, it became clear that staff morale skyrocketed under this new culture. In turn, customer satisfaction climbed because employees felt happier and were more eager to provide great service. Even the bottom line, previously, the sacred metric Hastings worshipped, remained healthy, bolstered by the positive publicity and a growing sense of goodwill. In short, the dire predictions didn't materialize. During one particularly moving moment, local news crews arrived to interview Lena, wanting her perspective on the changes. Standing in front of the diner's sign, she spoke honestly about her journey from being fired to helping shape company policy. In the background, you could see a volunteer loading crates of leftover food into a van headed for a neighborhood soup kitchen. "I think it's proof that kindness can be good business," she concluded, eyes shining with earnest conviction. The interview aired on the evening news, and the response was overwhelming. People wrote letters and emails to Wilton's corporate office, praising the shift in policy. Others shared personal stories of times they'd been helped by a restaurant or a compassionate individual. The diner saw an uptick in customers who specifically mentioned they wanted to support a place that put empathy before profit. Lena felt a wave of personal growth through it all. She wasn't just a server anymore. She had a voice that was being heard, and she used it to champion fairness and understanding. She'd never asked for the spotlight, but having it thrust upon her by circumstance gave her a platform to make a real difference, and she took that responsibility seriously. One afternoon, Daniel dropped by the diner unexpectedly. He asked Lena to join him in a short walk around the block to get some fresh air. It was a beautiful, crisp day, and they strolled through the neighborhood, passing shops and small businesses. "I wanted to let you know," Daniel began, "that we're launching a pilot program at other Wilton's branches. We'll be replicating everything we've done here: food donations, community engagement, employee welfare committees, and we'd like you to be part of the traveling team that helps train other locations." Lena nearly tripped over her own feet. "Me? Traveling team?" "Yes," he said with a chuckle. "We'll provide accommodations and extra pay, of course. But more importantly, I think you'll bring credibility. People will see you as someone who's been in their shoes, on the front line. You'll be able to connect with them in ways a corporate representative might not." Her initial reaction was a whirlwind of excitement and nerves. She worried about leaving her routine, about possibly being away from her sister. But then she realized what an incredible opportunity this was, to spread the kindness-first message and to help employees in other branches break free from any toxic environments. "I need to think about it," she said honestly. "But I'm honored you even asked." Daniel nodded, understanding. "Take your time. If you decide to stay here, that's fine too. We need good people in every location. But something tells me you'd do well in a mentorship role." They paused at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Lena fiddled with the strap of her bag, the weight of the decision pressing on her. "I just want to do what's right," she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. The light turned green and they proceeded across the street. "That's what you've been doing all along," he said softly. Later that day, Lena sat in the break room, mentally listing the pros and cons of taking on the traveling team position. On one hand, she'd have a chance to make a genuine impact on a larger scale, to help shape the culture of an entire chain. On the other, she'd be uprooting her life once again, stepping into unknown territory. A text from her sister arrived as she was mulling it over. "Proud of you. Keep shining, big sis." That simple message lifted her spirits. Maybe her sister would understand if she had to travel. Maybe this was the next step in a journey that had started with handing out a meal to a hungry stranger. Eventually, she found Daniel sitting in the corner booth reviewing a stack of documents. She slid into the seat across from him, heart pounding. "I'll do it," she said, voice firm but laced with excitement. "I'd like to join the traveling team. I want to help other employees in the same way I was helped here." His face lit up and he extended his hand. "You won't regret it, and neither will they." And so a new chapter began for Lena. Over the following weeks, she worked with a small group of staff trainers, refining protocols, scheduling site visits, and setting up collaborative workshops to introduce the new compassion-focused policies. She spent nights watching online tutorials on conflict resolution and management strategies, determined to be well prepared for her new responsibilities. Of course, no transition was without hiccups. She faced skeptics at a few branches who doubted the sustainability of these changes. Some managers she encountered were polite but dismissive, holding on to the belief that strict rules and fear were more effective than fostering kindness. But Lena's sincerity and first-hand story won many of them over. "I was you," she'd say to a doubtful manager, "until the day I got fired for doing something that cost the company nothing but saved a man's dignity. And that man turned out to be our CEO." That piece of the story, the shocking reveal, never failed to startle and soften the hardest hearts. Meanwhile, at the original Wilton's branch, the staff thrived under new management. Marta reported that arguments had decreased, cooperation had increased, and even the customers remarked on the improved vibe. It was as if a black cloud had passed. In quieter moments, Lena would catch herself wondering about Hastings. Where had he gone? Had he found another job? Had he learned anything from his downfall? She'd probably never know. But she took comfort in the idea that maybe, just maybe, watching his empire crumble so publicly might inspire some introspection. Months later, on an evening flight home after visiting a branch across the state, Lena gazed out of the airplane window. She reflected on how much her life had changed since that night she handed over a takeout box to a man she believed was homeless. She'd discovered her own courage, made new friends, traveled to new places, and helped reshape a company's culture for the better. When she landed, she found a voicemail from Daniel. "Hey, hope your flight was good. Corporate loved your latest report. I can't thank you enough for what you're doing. Give me a call when you're free." She smiled, saving the voicemail. There was still work to be done, more branches to visit, more hearts to win. But for once, she didn't feel the heaviness of an impossible burden. Instead, she felt the lightness of purpose. And that's how a single act of kindness grew into a movement. One meal in a disposable box had toppled a petty tyrant, reunited a company with its core values, and redefined a young woman's sense of self. Though the world was far from perfect, here in this corner of it, compassion had triumphed. And Lena, once just another name on a roster under a cruel manager's thumb, had become a beacon of hope, traveling wherever she was needed to remind people that kindness was not just a policy. It was the cornerstone of humanity.